Ancient Egyptian food preparation and bread making were central to daily life and required considerable skill, time, and coordination among family members. Bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet and was consumed at every meal by people of all social classes. The process of making bread from grain to finished loaves involved multiple steps that occupied much of each day and required specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Egyptian grain processing began with carefully stored wheat or barley that had been harvested during the previous growing season. The grain was kept in large ceramic jars or underground silos to protect it from moisture, insects, and rodents. Before grinding, the grain was sorted to remove stones, dirt, and damaged kernels that could affect the quality of the finished flour. This sorting was typically done by women and children who examined each handful of grain carefully. Ancient Egyptian grinding was accomplished using stone querns that consisted of two circular stones, positioned one above the other. The upper stone had a handle that allowed it to be rotated against the lower stone, crushing grain between the two surfaces. Operating a quern required considerable physical strength and endurance, because the grinding process was slow and labor-intensive. A skilled worker might produce only a few pounds of flour after hours of grinding. Egyptian flour quality varied significantly depending on the thoroughness of the grinding process and the type of stones used in the quern. Coarse flour contained pieces of grain, holes, and sometimes fragments of stone from the grinding surfaces. Fine flour was more time-consuming to produce but created superior bread. Most Egyptian families used coarse flour for everyday bread and reserved fine flour for special occasions and religious offerings. Ancient Egyptian bread dough preparation required mixing flour with water and sometimes other ingredients like salt, oil, or honey. The proportions had to be judged by experience because measuring tools were primitive and inconsistent. Too much water made dough sticky and difficult to handle. Too little water produced hard, dense bread. Experienced bakers could determine proper consistency by touch and develop techniques for adjusting recipes according to flour quality and weather conditions. Egyptian bread shaping was done entirely by hand using techniques that varied according to the intended use of the finished product. Everyday bread was formed into flat, round loaves that baked quickly and evenly. Special occasion bread might be shaped into elaborate forms representing animals, symbols, or religious figures. Some bread was formed into long, narrow loaves that could be easily carried by travelers or workers going to distant fields. Ancient Egyptian bread baking was accomplished using various methods depending on available equipment and fuel. The simplest method involved placing shaped dough on hot stones or pottery shards that had been heated in a fire. More sophisticated baking used clay ovens that could maintain consistent temperatures and bake multiple loaves simultaneously. Professional bakers operated large ovens that served entire neighborhoods. Egyptian oven construction required considerable skill and used materials that could withstand repeated heating and cooling cycles. Ovens were built from clay mixed with straw or other organic materials that burned out during firing, leaving small air spaces that provided insulation. The oven floor was made from flat stones or specially formed clay tiles. A domed roof concentrated heat and created even baking conditions. Ancient Egyptian oven operation required understanding of heat management and timing that came from years of experience. The oven was heated by burning wood or other fuel inside the baking chamber until it reached the proper temperature. The coals and ashes were then removed, and bread was placed inside to bake using residual heat. Judging the correct temperature required skill, because ovens had no thermometers or other measuring devices. Egyptian bread varieties included many different types suited to various occasions and social classes. Ordinary bread was made from barley flour and had a coarse texture and dark color. Wheat bread was finer and whiter but more expensive. Sweet bread, made with honey or dates, was prepared for festivals and religious ceremonies. Flatbread was practical for everyday meals, while raised bread required longer preparation but had better texture. Ancient Egyptian beer brewing was closely related to bread making because both processes used similar ingredients and techniques. Beer was made by partially baking bread made from malted grain, then soaking it in water and allowing natural fermentation to occur. The resulting beverage was thick and nutritious, providing essential vitamins and calories that supplemented the limited Egyptian diet. Egyptian food storage and preservation were essential for surviving periods when fresh food was not available. Bread was baked in large quantities and stored in sealed containers to protect it from moisture and pests. Dried bread could last for weeks and was reconstituted by soaking in water or beer. Other preservation methods included drying, salting, and fermenting various foods to extend their useful life. Ancient Egyptian cooking techniques were limited by available technology, but were sufficient for preparing nutritious and flavorful meals. Most cooking was done by boiling or stewing because these methods required less fuel than roasting. Clay pots of various sizes were used for different purposes. Large pots were used for cooking grains and stews, while smaller vessels were used for preparing sauces and individual portions. Egyptian meal preparation required careful planning and coordination because cooking was done over open fires that had to be maintained throughout the day. Fuel was often scarce and expensive, so families planned their cooking to make efficient use of available heat. Multiple dishes were often prepared in sequence using the same fire, and cooking schedules were arranged to have food ready at appropriate mealtimes. Ancient Egyptian kitchen equipment was simple but functional for the tasks required in food preparation. Sharp knives made from flint or metal were used for cutting meat and vegetables. Wooden spoons and ladles were used for stirring and serving. Grinding stones, processed spices, and other ingredients. Sieves made from woven reeds separated liquids from solids. Storage containers of various sizes held ingredients and finished foods. Egyptian food safety was a constant concern in the hot climate where spoilage occurred rapidly. Fresh foods had to be consumed quickly or preserved immediately after preparation. Water for cooking was often boiled to kill harmful organisms. Salt was used extensively as a preservative, and vinegar was employed to pickle vegetables. Despite these precautions, food poisoning was common and sometimes fatal. Ancient Egyptian dietary restrictions were imposed by religious beliefs, economic circumstances, and seasonal availability. Certain foods were forbidden during religious festivals or periods of mourning. Expensive foods like meat and fine flour were reserved for special occasions. Seasonal variations in food availability required families to adjust their diets according to what was growing or available in local markets. Egyptian family roles in food preparation were clearly defined according to gender and age. Women typically managed all aspects of food preparation, including grinding grain, baking bread, and cooking meals. Men might assist with heavy tasks like operating large grinding stones or carrying water. Children helped with simple tasks like sorting grain and gathering fuel for cooking fires. Ancient Egyptian communal cooking occurred during festivals, religious ceremonies, and other special occasions when large quantities of food needed to be prepared for many people. These events required extensive planning and coordination among multiple families or community groups. Large ovens and cooking areas were shared, and tasks were divided according to individual skills and available time. Egyptian food distribution within families followed established hierarchies that reflected social status and family relationships. The head of the household was served first and received the choicest portions. Other family members received food according to their age, gender, and position in the family structure. Children and elderly family members might receive smaller portions or different types of food suited to their needs. Ancient Egyptian mummification was the most complex and sophisticated preservation process developed in the ancient world, requiring specialized knowledge, expensive materials, and weeks of careful work to transform a deceased body into an eternal vessel for the soul. This elaborate procedure was available primarily to wealthy Egyptians, who could afford the extensive time and resources required for proper mummification. Egyptian mummification beliefs were rooted in religious concepts about the afterlife and the eternal nature of the human soul. Egyptians believed that preserving the physical body was essential for the deceased person's continued existence in the afterlife. Without proper mummification, the soul would be unable to recognize its body and would wander eternally without rest. This belief made mummification one of the most important services in Egyptian society. Ancient Egyptian embalmers were highly skilled specialists who underwent years of training to master the complex procedures required for successful mummification. These craftsmen were organized into workshops that operated under strict religious supervision. The most skilled embalmers could charge enormous fees for their services and were sought after by wealthy families throughout Egypt. Lesser embalmers provided simpler preservation services for people with more limited resources. Egyptian mummification preparation began immediately after death. When the body was delivered to the embalming workshop, the deceased was placed on a slanted table that allowed fluids to drain away during the preservation process. Embalmers first washed the body thoroughly with wine and spices to remove dirt and begin the purification process. The body was then examined to determine the appropriate level of treatment based on the family's ability to pay. Ancient Egyptian brain removal was one of the most delicate procedures in the mummification process. Embalmers used long metal instruments inserted through the nose to break up the brain tissue and remove it piece by piece. This process required considerable skill to avoid damaging the face or skull. The empty skull cavity was then rinsed with various liquids and sometimes filled with resin or other preservative materials. Egyptian organ removal required opening the abdomen and carefully extracting the internal organs that would decay rapidly if left in the body. The stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines were removed through a small incision on the left side of the abdomen. The heart was usually left in place because Egyptians believed it was the center of intelligence and emotion and would be needed in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian canopic jars were specially designed containers used to store the removed organs. During the mummification process, these jars had lids carved to represent the 4 sons of Horus, each of whom protected a specific organ. The stomach was placed in the jar with the human-headed lid, the liver in the jar with the falcon-headed lid, the lungs in the jar with the baboon-headed lid, and the intestines in the jar with the jackal-headed lid. Egyptian dehydration was accomplished using natron, a naturally occurring salt that removed moisture from the body tissues. The body was packed inside and out with natron and left to dry for approximately 40 days. This process removed most of the water content from the tissues and prevented bacterial decay. The amount of natron required and the length of the drying period depended on the size of the body and environmental conditions. Ancient Egyptian cleansing followed the dehydration period and involved removing all traces of natron from the body. The dried body was carefully washed and any remaining natron was brushed away. The body was then rubbed with oils and resins that helped preserve the skin and gave it a more lifelike appearance. This process required delicate handling because the dried tissues were fragile and could be easily damaged. Egyptian stuffing restored the body's shape after the dehydration process had caused it to shrink and become misshapen. The abdomen was filled with sawdust, linen, or other materials to restore its original appearance. Sometimes the removed organs were wrapped and returned to the body cavity. The limbs and face might be padded to maintain proper proportions. Artificial eyes were sometimes inserted to replace those that had been damaged during preservation. Ancient Egyptian wrapping was the final and most visible stage of the mummification process. The body was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips that had been soaked in resins and preservative substances. Each finger and toe was wrapped individually before the entire hand or foot was wrapped. The wrapping process could take several days and required considerable skill to achieve the proper appearance. Egyptian amulets were placed between the layers of wrapping to provide magical protection for the deceased in the afterlife. These small objects represented various gods and symbols that were believed to have protective powers. The most important amulet was the heart scarab, which was placed over the heart and inscribed with spells to ensure the deceased would pass the judgment of the dead. Successfully. Ancient Egyptian masks were placed over the wrapped head to provide an idealized representation of the deceased's face. These masks were made from various materials depending on the family's wealth. Royal mummies wore masks of gold, while wealthy commoners might have masks of painted wood or cutnage. Poor people might have simple painted linen faces or no masks at all. Egyptian sarcophagi were elaborate coffins designed to protect the mummy for eternity. These containers were often nested, with the mummy placed in a series of progressively larger coffins. The innermost coffin was fitted closely to the body's shape, while outer coffins were more rectangular. Each coffin was decorated with religious texts and symbols intended to assist the deceased in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian mummification costs varied, dramatically depending on the level of service provided. The most expensive mummification could cost the equivalent of several years' wages for an ordinary worker. This elaborate process included brain removal, organ extraction, extended dehydration, careful wrapping with expensive materials, and burial in multiple decorated coffins. Middle-class families might choose simpler procedures that omitted some steps or used less expensive materials. Egyptian workshop organization was necessary to handle the complex logistics of mummification. Large workshops employed dozens of workers with different specializations. Some workers specialized in organ removal, others in wrapping, and still others in creating masks and coffins. The workshop had to maintain supplies of natron, resins, linen, and other materials. Scheduling was important because both had to be processed in sequence according to strict timetables. Ancient Egyptian quality control ensured that mummification met religious requirements and family expectations. Master embalmers supervised the work of assistants and checked each stage of the process. Religious inspectors might visit workshops to ensure that proper procedures were followed. Families sometimes appointed representatives to observe the mummification of their loved ones and ensure that contracted services were properly provided. Egyptian mummification innovations developed over many centuries as refined their techniques and discovered new preservation methods. Early mummification was relatively simple and often unsuccessful. Later periods saw the development of more sophisticated procedures that produced better preserved bodies. However, the quality of mummification declined during periods of political instability when resources were limited and traditional knowledge was lost. Ancient Egyptian procedures were sometimes attempted when embalmers tried new techniques or dealt with unusual circumstances. Different preservative substances were tested to see which produced the best results. Various wrapping patterns were tried to achieve optimal protection. Some experiments were successful and became standard practice, while others were abandoned as ineffective or too expensive. Egyptian religious supervision ensured that mummification procedures followed proper ritual requirements. Priests oversaw the embalming process and performed necessary ceremonies at each stage. Religious texts were recited during the procedures to ensure spiritual protection for the deceased. The entire process was considered a sacred ritual that required both technical skill and religious knowledge to perform correctly. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing was one of the most complex and sophisticated writing systems ever developed, combining pictographic, ideographic, and phonetic elements to record everything from religious texts to business transactions. Learning to read and write hieroglyphs required years of intensive study and was limited to a small educated elite who served as scribes in temples, government offices, and wealthy households. Egyptian scribe training began in childhood when boys from well-connected families were selected for education in specialized schools attached to temples or government buildings. The training process was long and difficult, requiring students to memorize hundreds of hieroglyphic signs and learn the complex rules governing their use. Physical punishment was commonly used to motivate students and ensure they mastered the challenging curriculum. Ancient Egyptian writing materials were expensive and carefully prepared to ensure high-quality results. Papyrus was the preferred writing surface and was made from reeds that grew along the Nile River. The reeds were cut into strips, laid in crossing patterns, and pressed together to form smooth sheets. Papyrus was expensive to produce and was often reused by scraping off old writing to make room for new text. Egyptian ink production required specialized knowledge and expensive materials. Black ink was made from carbon mixed with gum and water to create a permanent writing medium. Red ink was made from iron oxide and was used for headings, corrections, and special emphasis. The ink was formed into solid cakes that were mixed with water as needed. High-quality ink was essential for producing clear, lasting writing. Ancient Egyptian writing instruments were simple but effective, tools that remained unchanged for thousands of years. Scribes used reed pens cut to fine points and shaped to hold ink properly. The pens were made from specific types of reeds that grew in marshes, and were carefully prepared by trimming and shaping the writing tip. Multiple pens were often prepared in advance because the tips wore out quickly during extended writing sessions. Egyptian hieroglyphic signs numbered in the hundreds and included representations of people, animals, objects, and abstract concepts. Each sign could function in multiple ways depending on its context within a particular text. Some signs represented the objects they depicted, others stood for sounds or syllables, and still others served as determinatives that clarified the meaning of adjacent signs. Learning all these functions required extensive memorization and practice. Ancient Egyptian text layout followed complex rules that governed the arrangement of hieroglyphic signs within lines and columns. Signs could be written from left to right, right to left, or in vertical columns, depending on the type of text and available space. The direction of writing was indicated by the orientation of human and animal figures, which always faced the beginning of the line. Scribes had to plan carefully to fit text into available space while maintaining proper proportions. Egyptian scribal equipment was organized in portable kits that allowed scribes to work in various locations. A typical kit included reed pens, ink cakes, a water pot for mixing ink, a pallet for holding writing materials, and a case for storing finished documents. Some kits also included rulers, erasers, and other specialized tools. Scribes took pride in their equipment and often had their names inscribed on valuable pieces. Ancient Egyptian document types varied widely depending on their intended purpose and audience. Religious texts required the most careful preparation and often included elaborate decorations and illustrations. Legal documents followed standard formats and used specific terminology. Personal letters were written in cursive script that was faster to write than formal hieroglyphs. Administrative records used abbreviated forms and standard formulas to save time and materials. Egyptian text correction was necessary when scribes made errors. During the writing process, minor mistakes could be corrected by scraping away incorrect signs and writing over the cleaned surface. More serious errors might require starting over with a new piece of papyrus. Some texts show multiple correction attempts where scribes tried various solutions to fix problems without having to rewrite entire documents. Ancient Egyptian reading skills required not only knowledge of hieroglyphic signs but also understanding of the cultural and religious contexts in which texts were written. Many texts contained references to mythology, religious beliefs, and historical events that would be familiar to educated Egyptians, but might not be explicitly explained. Readers had to bring considerable background knowledge to their interpretation of written materials. Egyptian copying work was a major part of scribal activity because important texts needed to be reproduced to prevent their loss. Master scribes supervised copying projects and checked the accuracy of finished work. Copying required extreme care because errors could corrupt important information. Some texts were considered so sacred that even minor copying errors were believed to have serious spiritual consequences. Ancient Egyptian professional specialization developed among scribes who focused on particular types of writing. Some scribes specialized in religious texts and worked primarily in temples. Others focused on legal documents and worked in courts or government offices. Military scribes accompanied armies and recorded campaigns and battles. Medical scribes copied and preserved texts about healing and anatomy. Egyptian writing speed varied depending on the type of script being used and the formality of the document. Formal hieroglyphic writing was slow and deliberate, with each sign carefully formed for maximum clarity and aesthetic appeal. Cursive scripts could be written much faster but were less formal and sometimes harder to read. Experienced scribes could adjust their writing speed according to the requirements of each project. Ancient Egyptian text preservation was a constant concern because Papyrus was vulnerable to damage from moisture, insects, and rough handling. Important documents were stored in sealed containers and kept in dry locations. Some texts were copied onto more durable materials like stone or pottery for permanent preservation. Despite these efforts, many ancient Egyptian texts have been lost over the centuries. Egyptian scribal errors were sometimes deliberately introduced when scribes disagreed with the content they were copying or when they wanted to update outdated information. These changes could accumulate over multiple copying generations, leading to significant variations between different versions of the same text. Scholars today must compare multiple copies to reconstruct original texts and understand how they evolved over time. Ancient Egyptian abbreviation systems were developed to speed up the writing process and save valuable papyrus. Frequently used words and phrases were represented by shortened forms that experienced scribes could recognize easily. Administrative documents made extensive use of abbreviations and standard formulas. However, abbreviations could sometimes lead to confusion when their meaning was not clear from context. Egyptian bilingual texts were created when Egypt came into contact with other cultures that used different writing systems. These texts often contained the same information written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and foreign scripts like Greek or Demotic. Bilingual texts were valuable for translation and cultural exchange, but required scribes who were fluent in multiple languages and writing systems. Ancient Egyptian text illustration was an important feature of many documents, particularly religious and literary works. Scribes who could combine writing skills with artistic ability were highly valued and commanded higher fees for their services. Illustrations were carefully integrated with text and often provided additional information that supplemented the written content. The combination of text and image created documents that were both informative and visually appealing. Egyptian scribal social status was generally high because literacy was rare and valuable in ancient Egyptian society. Scribes were exempt from physical labor and military service, and many achieved positions of considerable influence in government and religious institutions. However, scribal work was demanding and required constant attention to detail. The best scribes enjoyed comfortable lives and social respect, while less skilled practitioners struggled to find adequate employment.